concern is the concern is that there will be a number that just simply will not vote, or if they do choose to vote, they will leave the presidency blank. But that's similar for the Democratic Party. You have a number of typical Democratic voters who are not enamored with President Biden as a candidate and have expressed that they do not want to vote for him, and yet they cannot bring themselves to vote for Donald Trump. And so the fear is that they will also just not turn out. I'm going to suggest, and we can talk about it as the discussion goes on, that the Democratic Party faces the tougher challenge here in terms of turnout because of the nature of their coalition as it's emerged in the last 10 years or so. A common perception is that the Democratic Party is the party of the working class, and that has been the case in history. But anybody that has any knowledge of the party system will know that that's not been the case for some time. In the 1960s, the working class in the United States was primarily white. It was primarily male, and the blue collar characterization of their activities were primarily manufacturing, a lot of construction jobs. And most of these were unionized, so it was organized labor. Those that were not part of a union benefited from a climate where unionized labor could throw around their weight. And so even though you didn't have, you still had a number of pockets that were not unionized. Unions and organized labor played an important part in organizing the working class and maintain the rank and file towards the Democratic Party. Today, the working class in the United States is much different. They're more likely to be in the fields of healthcare or elder care rather than manufacturing. They are also more likely to be in food service rather than working construction jobs. Many are women, and they are much, much less likely to be unionized. And unions and organized labor are a faint cry of what they were in the 1960s. They are also much more likely to be, or the working class is much less likely to have a college degree. And what we see is that the recent poll of this group, this working class, and this is from the Progressive Policy Institute in November 2023, sees that this group is split between the Democratic and Republican parties. About 38% trust that the Democratic Party will operate for working class interests, and about 37% trust that Republicans are going to better represent working class interests, and about 25% don't trust either of the parties. However, what we saw in 2020 was that Trump won approximately 59% of this working class vote. He did even better in 2016, winning approximately 62%. And we also see that manifestation on the edge of education. And so college educated voters were more likely to be voting for Biden. In fact, there was a 24-point difference between Biden and Trump among the college educated voters. And this is significantly different than what we saw because in recent past, because in 1996, Democratic Party was made up of approximately 22% who were college educated. In 2020, that number rose to 45%. And so from 1996 to 2020, we've seen more than a doubling of college educated people who are identifying as Democrats and voting as Democrats. And so, right, the working class has been divided and you have the college educated that are primarily going now toward, or significantly moving towards, the Democratic Party. The working class is still very suspicious of the Democratic Party. And so in that same PPI poll from last November, 45% believe that the Democratic Party has moved too far to the left, and 40% believe that the party has been captured by special interests. When asked about what those special interests might be, they identified public sector unions, environmental activists, and academics. And so there is a resentment, at least among a large portion of the working class, against the Democratic Party, who they feel don't represent them at all. And if you look at some of those categories, they happen to be where you would find more educated workers or parts of the population. A majority also see and policy issues that Republicans would do better managing the economy, promoting entrepreneurship, fighting crime, and addressing immigration. And so the Democratic Party is facing a major division among or between educated progressives. These are educated progressive voters who are very liberal on social issues, things such as rights for the LGBTQ community, and other issues related, are very strong for this group. They present solutions to immigration that the rest of the working class do not agree with. And the working class is concerned about the economy and inflation, but they see the problem of the economy right now stemming more from the government stimulus outlays from the COVID period rather than COVID itself or supply side dislocations. On top of all of this division of working class and educated within the Democratic rank and file, you also have a rising portion of the Democratic Party who are non-white. In 1996, 77% of the Democratic Party was white. In 2023, that number is down to 56%. And so you have more than 40% of the Democratic Party voters and those who identify who are people of color. 18% of that is African American, 16% is Hispanic, 10% are other, including Asians, Native Americans, mixed, different kinds of ways of identifying. That's a change that's happening in the United States, but the Republican Party is still primarily white. And so in 2023, they are 79% identifying as white. Republicans in 1996 were 93%. So there is a change there. When we add all of this together, what we find is that with the education mix that of white voters, you have really a small portion of the white working class, about 26% that are supporting the Democratic Party. Yet, right, this group in 1996 made up of approximately 59%. And so the Democratic Party is in this very difficult position of trying to satisfy people that have very different views for policies and for the direction of government. The Democrats, we see this very big tension of social policy against economic policies. And the working class simply doesn't agree with a lot of what the progressive, educated liberals of the party are pushing. And so, right, the concern is that it's not only a Biden drag, but there is a policy drag, and that turnout is not going to favor the Democrats, even though they have an advantage with educated voters coming out to vote more often. And so the real concern that I would want to throw it into this mix and I'm concluding now, I see my 10 minutes is up, is that it's really the Democratic Party that is in the position that's a defensive position, and they have to figure out how to thread the needle and satisfy their voters. Thank you very much. Florine, you're muted.
You want me up?
Okay, sorry about that. So we move on to Ron, yes. Thank you.
Okay. Should I go? So I'm Ron King. I'm Professor Emeritus at San Diego State University. I've been coming to Cluj before most of you were born. I've been coming to Cluj before there was a faculty of political science, when it was a wing of the section of contemporary history within the Faculty of History. I've got many friends and co-authors on the faculty, and so just thank you to inviting me, and hello to all of you out there. I guess of the four of us speaking on this panel, I'm the closest to what you might call an elections expert, and that's still a very long distance. But what I want to do today is think about the 2024 election in terms of how political scientists see the analysis. This is not what commentators say. It's not what the newspapers say. It's not what the talkers and screamers say. In fact, when you encounter one of the talkers and screamers, ask them what's the last systematic book on election behavior they've ever read. If they haven't read one, well, it shows you they're talkers and screamers. But political scientists have lots of data on election, and generally, the analysis is that there are three layers of analysis of elections. The long-term layer of slowly changing influences, deeply rooted in public behavior. Most often it's party identification. These are not necessarily rational attachments. They're more like fandom or teamsmanship. You root for Manchester United or for Barcelona. They're psychological attachments. They're group identifications. People like me tend to vote with this party. Overwhelmingly, about 90% of Republican affiliates vote for Republicans. Overwhelmingly, 90% of Democratic affiliates vote for Democrats. They'll tell you they look at the issues and they meander and they consider the candidates but it's mostly rationalization. We can predict that about 90% of Democrats will vote Democratic. The middle layer is how the country's doing. Again, it's not especially conceptual. It is it's myopic. Sort of 4 to 5 months before the election, is the country in the right direction or the wrong direction? And mostly this concerns the state of the economy. But it's not necessarily an educated estimation of economic forecasts. It's sort of like firing a football coach. The team has won, the coach is wonderful. The team who's losing, the coach is terrible. And so you fire the coach and change him. And so it's that kind of yes or no, the country's doing all right, keep the coach, keep the president. The country's not doing all right, throw the president out. Retrospective voting theory. And then the shorter term layer, the campaign, the candidates, the issues, the advertising, and all the hoopla about election time. And contrary to what most people will tell you, the short run factors are the least important. The long run factors are the most important. That the short run factors when people rationalize, I pay attention to the campaigns, but about 90% of voters have made up their mind already for the US presidential election. And it's not very much different than previous presidential elections. The elections are decided by the 10% of voters who are truly undecided. And these tend to be the least engaged in politics, the least aware of issues, the least attentive to parties at elections, the least caring about political events. So campaigns, the short run, is focused on turning out the faithful, something Paul talked about, and raising money, which is big time in the US, and trying some degree to attract the unattentive. Don't expect high principled campaigns. That's mostly speaking to the already committed. That these are symbolic, symbol creation exercises rather than intellectual disputes. And the symbols are targeted to the extent that anyone's listening to the very small percentage that decide the election. So what does this mean for 2024? First of all, regarding long-term factors, there's been a gradual but decisive change in party identification. Paul referred to some of it. That, first of all, party identification is becoming more and more rigid. That commentators speak of culture wars or growing polarization in the US. For example, it used to be said that fathers would tell their daughters not to marry outside their race or ethnicity. Now they're telling their daughters, don't marry outside of our political party. Don't you dare marry a Republican, or don't you dare marry a Democrat. There's a bunch of examples of individual voters who hate their party's candidate, think their party's candidate is absolutely, completely unacceptable. Yet they will vote for the unacceptable candidate of their party rather than an attractive candidate from the other party because it's our team versus their team. And he still wrote for the home squad. And so a good number of Republicans who will hate Trump doesn't matter whether Biden is attractive or unattractive, it's the other team and you can't support it. What's driving this increased tension, this increased polarization, this increased rigidity of American politics that affects a growing and growing percentage of Americans? Paul referred to it a bit. And I hate to tell you this because I really don't want it to be true. But of all the factors, and there are many, many factors, everything is multidimensional. But of all the factors, the one that seems to jump out most is race. In 2007, prior to the Obama presidency, whites vote divided 50-50. In 2016, whites divided 54-39, and as Paul indicated, it's even more extreme now. Whites, especially working class whites, have moved to the Republican Party. And these are rigid attachments. It's not simply being anti-Black or anti-Hispanic. Whites in America, and this is again very disturbing poll data, that whites believe their country is being lost. It's their country and it's being lost. They're afraid of not being the majority in America anymore. So whites are increasingly saying that they have things in common with other whites, that the value of whites in the contribution of whites to American history has been undervalued, that whites have to stick together to protect their values and protect their privileges. This is a very disturbing trend. It's not simply Donald Trump. It is existing in America regardless of Donald Trump, but Trump certainly activates it. In the medium run, the state of the economy, well, Americans are still apprehensive since COVID, and the inflation fears are growing. There's raging apprehensions exacerbated by the anti-Biden press. The latest data, I saw it in this morning's newspaper because you got me up so early, is that consumer spending is now down relative to last quarter. And then the indicator I use most is expectations of purchasing consumer durables. You think you're going to buy consumer durables in the next period of time. And that's the expectation is going down. And so Biden's going to get no benefit from that at all. He's also going to, the United States has gotten much more unequal over time. According to the US Census Bureau, we're about 25% more unequal. Hello, Colleen. The United States is now about 25% more unequal than it was in 1970. So even during the good times, the benefits flow to the upper class and almost not at all to the working class. Working class median incomes are just about stagnant, raising slightly over the last 20, 30 years. And so Biden is going to get no help from middle range factors. And as for the campaign, everyone seems to focus on personalities and they pay attention to scandals and trials, and it has the least impact. Regarding issues, the Democrats are hoping for a boost from women regarding the abortion issue. Republicans are hoping for a boost from nativists regarding immigration. But the real issue is very simple for the truly undecided voters. Trump represents energy, dynamism. He's going to restore the sort of faith in America. It's all vague. It's all unenforceable. It's all pretend. But he represents dynamism. And for the unattached voter, the question is, does Trump's dynamism has to be weighed against, is he crazy? If he's not crazy, but dynamism wins. If he is crazy, but dynamism doesn't win. For Biden, well, Biden represents moderate, reasoned, cautious, quiet, boring politics. And the question for him is, can he find enough energy to say that he has the capacity, the strength to lead America? His first 4 years have not shown it at all. The rhetoric is good, but it's not forceful. So where does this leave us? All signs point to a very close election. As I read the tea leaves, I think Paul reads them the same way. It's tilting a bit towards Trump. If I had to do the odds, it would be sort of 52-48 or so. Trump's dynamic calls for action seem to work. And Biden, as Paul pointed out, the Democrats are going to have a turnout problem. It's not just Biden's middling, muddling stances, but that on immigration, on Palestine, and economic justice, on racial justice, there's just no focus. There's no attachment to what America means. And Biden, therefore, is a rudderless president. No matter what, this election is going to do very little to resolve the tensions that are afflicting U.S. politics and U.S. society. And I wish I was wrong, but it's going to be more of the same. Finally, a word about the youth vote. There isn't one. Period. That young people tend to vote with their parents, that with much lower turnout rates. Biden, by his age and his disposition, doesn't inspire them. His support for Israeli aggression has turned many off. I don't imagine there's going to be much of a distinctive youth vote. And although commentators are going to talk about it a lot, I think it's sort of not going to be there. If this account sounds very hard-headed and cynical, I do not apologize. Political mythology abounds, but there are excellent scholars who study elections systematically. One of my favorite recent books is Democracy for Realists by Aiken and Bartels. It's necessary to go beyond the popular headlines, to get beyond the screamers and yellers, to do serious data-driven analysis, because that's what we do as systematic political scientists. Okay, I'm done. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Ron. Hello.
Still have me?
Huh?
Are you still having me follow up?
Yeah.
Great. I'm gonna need your help getting my screen share. Perhaps you can assist here. All right.
All right, well, it's great to join both Ron King and Paul to discuss the presidential election. I'm Jeff Sommers. I'm one of the Fulbrighters here along with Daniel. And I do work in political economy. So I was asked to look at economic issues and more specifically to look at some of the economic headwinds that Biden is encountering in the 2024 presidential race. Now, one of the things that we're seeing with the economic commentary in the United States is this sense that the economy is doing fantastic on the numbers. So whether you're reading Paul Krugman or Dean Baker or one of any number of other economic columnists or economists, they're all looking at the macroeconomic fundamentals of the country, how great they are, and they're wondering why the electorate isn't seeing this. So what I want to suggest is that perhaps the electorate is not blind. Maybe they are seeing some things that perhaps the economic commentariat class is not seeing. So let's look at some of these economic factors in play here. So let's take a look at first where the economy is doing very well and why many economists are very frustrated that the public isn't seeing what in fact is demonstrably true in terms of how the economy is doing well. We have inflation adjusted wages up. This is something we haven't seen for a long time in the United States. And it's broad-based. This isn't just a mean or an average figure. If you go down to, say, the bottom full 80% of the labor force, production and non-supervisory workers, they're seeing their wages actually up. We're seeing inflation coming down. The core rate, these are items that don't fluctuate a lot. So things aside from fuel, like food and energy, et cetera, that's really coming down. The non-core fuel, food and energy, a little bit less so. The unemployment rate, it's rising, but it's still pretty low. It's under 4%. We use something called the U3 rate in the United States, which might be part of the problem. It doesn't really measure people who are no longer working. We used to use something called U6, which captured the real state of unemployment, which today is around 7% in the United States. And then in terms of a long-term factor, which shows real promise for the United States economy to do well going forward, with some caveats, is the productivity rate is way up right now. We don't fully understand why, but we just know that it's up from the data. So again, looking at this chart below for production and non-supervisory workers, again, most working people, the bottom 80% of the workforce, we see with this blue line that ever since the last 2 years, their wages are actually going up above the rate of inflation. Why aren't workers recognizing this? Well, it may be because we have a mix of workers, some who are actually still seeing their wages down below the rate of inflation, others who are seeing them well up. And then this is just a bar chart rather, which shows that wages are up above most of these costs in the economy, with the exception of food. And that's something that everyone needs. And so that's something that people are very sensitive to, food costs. Really not coming down much. Here's that U3 rate that I referenced. You can see that it's bouncing around this extremely low about a year ago. Now it's bouncing back up a little bit, but still under 4%. So still very good, leaving economists wonder, what is the problem here? Why are people disgruntled? With the inflation rate, just a new consumer price numbers released. You can see that we had this big stagflation era in the late 70s up till about 1980. That's where the blue line goes on south of the chart here. Right now, we're about again 3.4%. Not bad at all. But we're starting to see some problems. This slide is a little bit out of order here, so you'll have to excuse that. I'm going to start discussing headwinds now. What are some factors in the economy that are causing some people to be a little bit upset about how things are? We get to 2024 here. You can see that the rise in medical costs is really significant. So this is something that, of course, people are really feeling in their pocketbooks, aside from just the issue of food and health. I mean, these are really, really big items in their family budgets. As I mentioned here before, we have this productivity growth issue that I mentioned here. What's really, really interesting, again, is that we see this big rise here in 2023. This is continuing to 2024. We haven't really seen anything like this since the Clinton years. And then the other big one was the post-World War II boom. This is suggestive of something that could be quite transformative in the economy. And it bodes very, very well, but it's not something that people are actually feeling in the present. All right. I've actually mentioned some of these headwinds already. As I said, some of the slides somehow got out of order. But we have this issue, again, of, as one of our past presidents from the 1960s, Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, once noted in this rather frustrated, perplexed fashion in a television address that he had in 1968 before he decided to pull out of the re-election race. He was really perplexed as to why the public was not understanding how well things were going. And as he said, I'm not saying, have you ever had it so good? Rhetorical question. He answered it himself. But have you? You know, well, no, people just weren't seeing it like he was. And again, for several reasons, mortgage rate increases and rent increases, the end of the COVID money, these various federal government supports, auto insurance rates going way up, health costs, as I already mentioned, credit card interest rates going way up, income, some strange things happening there, which I'll address later, and then a kind of a point that financial commentators discuss frequently, the yield curve inversion on bond rates, which often presage a recession. Most voters, of course, are not looking at that, but nonetheless, I would toss that in as a reason why we might be having some potential problems on the horizon. But among these economic factors that are really just making a lot of voters unnervous, or really nervous, unnerved, auto insurance. So this is something that most working people have to have, and the rates have just skyrocketed the past few years. The average annual cost of full coverage for auto insurance has gone from $1,600 when Biden came into office to over $2,000 today. I saw this with my own auto insurance rates. I was wondering, what's going on? Inflation is really low. But auto insurers, for whatever reason, have taken this last 2-year time period as an opportunity to really increase rates, and they've gotten away. I mentioned the medical cost here. Sorry, this is just a repetition of that one slide, somehow that out of order. Mortgage rates and rents, we can see here when Biden came into office, 30-year standard fixed mortgage rates were roughly a little bit over 3%. Now they're around 7%. That's a big increase for people in cost, for people who are trying to buy homes. So it's really causing a lot of frustration among young people, people who are purchasing their first homes, trying to get a start. But can you escape it by just renting? No, because they're killing you on that side of the ledger here too. So rents are really going up in recent years. I have to admit, I own a house and I rent it out, and I'm just going with the market. There's nothing I can do about it, but I'm sorry, I have to raise your rent. So rents are going way up, and it's really posing a hardship to people. And then there's, we had COVID, of course. Everyone was sick, and the economy seized up. It contracted by, nearly 30%. It was nothing short of a veritable 1930s Great Depression. And so the government wisely turned on the money machine. You just got in there and the money was everywhere. It was just there to grab. You were in there, it was flying all around you. And it was easy to manage during that period financially. There were endless programs and businesses as well for individuals and people. And you can see here from 2020 to 2022, this gray bar chart here represents the COVID-related spending that was available. And then there are some other government programs that are still making money available, but the COVID money spigot has been turned off. And what does that mean? Well, it means this party is kind of over, and people are having to re-enter the labor market. The good news is that there are jobs there for the most part, but at less favorable conditions that existed prior to 2022, prior to 2023. So people don't like that. For this very nice window of about 2 years, they were able to be really choosy on what jobs they took. And that meant that they could take better jobs at better pay. That party is kind of ended, and they've turned off the air pressure on this machine. The cash is no longer blowing around. So if there's not as much money to grab out there, well, then you have to make recourse to your credit cards. That's how Americans have traditionally dealt with situations in which there's not enough income, at least from their perspective. I mean, they grab the Visa and they start charging. Well, not only have savings gone down dramatically, they were way up when the money machine was blowing cash, but they are making use of the credit cards. The interest rates have come way, way up here. In the third quarter of 2023, we're still roughly around this already. They went to over 20%. Now, inflation is less than 4%. I mean, this is a nice windfall opportunity for banks to really make a nice killing. Of course, here in 2013, they were down to under 12%. But these are all costs that American consumers are having to bear. Getting into the weeds a little bit here, more with income, we can see that the job situation as the data suggests. Really see annually going down. So people have these gig economy jobs. Well, there are a couple of dollars actually. You might say that's a good thing. For some people it is, for other people it isn't. And in terms of real median household income, they actually see some declines here over the past few years. Also a function of these reduced hours and this more gig economy structure. I'm not going to get into the yield curve inversion business here, other than just to say that we have this inversion of long and short-term bond rates right now. We're in one of those periods. We've had them here in around 2006 when we had a Senate election in which it showed a flipping of that body. We had one around 2000. We had one during the administration of the first Bush, George H.W., not W, number 41, not number 43. That helped to get Bill Clinton elected, along with this very eccentric character named Ross Perot, who ran a very strong third-party race. And of course, the big one was at the end of the Carter administration. So these have often portended, well, they all have portended to date, a pending recession. Whether this one will be followed by the same, too hard to tell. Okay, I'll stop there so that we can have Daniel speak. Thank you.
Okay, if I just stand here not in front of the camera, I don't know how to organize this. Okay, I guess they can at least hear me. So when I was asked to speak at this panel, I thought, oh no, I'm not an elections expert by any stretch. So I'm going to take the easy way out. I'm going to sidestep the issue of the election, and I want to focus instead on some of the potential consequences for state and society. And thinking through these issues, I'm going to talk about political violence, democratic institutions, and some policy issues. And I would like to argue, I think, on a hopeful note, that maybe the stakes are not quite as high as they seem. So for one, a major concern among many election watchers is the potential for political violence. Of course, we all remember the insurrection following the 2020 election. We maybe heard stories about extremists intimidating election officials, plots to kidnap, kill, or otherwise harm elected officials. And there's been some provocative survey data recently that's showing a large share of Americans, sometimes upwards of 20, 30, even 40% saying that they support politically motivated violence. The research, when we look a little closer, shows that the threats of political violence are from the far right, primarily, are the most politically salient. And there are two subgroups in particular that are most prone to this scenario. One is the Christian evangelical Republican demographic, and I'm kind of taking some liberties to characterize here, but the basic cultural narrative here is that Democrats and cultural elites are somehow allied with evil forces that are against Christianity and seeking to harm the conservative values. And the other group here is those who feel threatened by women or minorities. And so the bedrock idea here, uniting right-wing communities who condone violence, is that white Christian men in the United States are under cultural and demographic threat and require defending. And that the Republican Party and Donald Trump as its leader will safeguard their way of life, right? So this is an idea, a cultural idea that's been referenced in some of the other comments already. But there is also research that suggests the threat of political violence is overblown. Despite the media attention that it receives, political violence is still exceedingly rare in the United States. It accounts for only about 1% of all hate crimes that are reported in the US. And the political survey data, there's also research to suggest that political survey data is misleading, and that when we look at more sophisticated measures and survey methods, we can find more nuanced attitudes towards political violence, and in fact, even extremely high support for criminally charging suspects who commit acts of political violence, right? So there's a kind of moderating factor beneath the surface that might give us some hope. Turning to the threat to democratic institutions, much has been made of the anti-democratic nature of Trump and his far-right populist movements, and the threat of democratic backsliding in the US. I don't have to tell this group about that concept, but I think especially concerning are the explicit references to examples like Viktor Orban's Hungary as a model. There actually a few years ago started a new conference, the CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, which is a really influential conference among conservatives in the US. They started an offshoot in Budapest called CPAC Hungary, and it's been going for 3 years now. And there is a clear kind of cross-fertilization of ideas. We see ideologues in the conservative media interviewing political leaders like Orban and even Putin. And we also, of course, see the anti-democratic nature of much of Trump's rhetoric. But I want to talk a little bit more about how this would actually happen, right? What does the threat actually look like? And I've done a bit of research on this in a specific policy area related to the refugee resettlement program in the United States. But I'm going to refer to the broader concept of administrative deconstruction as an idea, right? So the rhetoric here is that Trump is trying to defend the American people against the quote-unquote deep state, right? So this is the nameless, faceless bureaucrats and elites who want to overturn, the conservative values and the American way of life. And so the overall thrust, right, of Trump's agenda in terms of the threat to democratic institutions has to do with this dismantling of the deep state. In fact, in his Agenda 47, which is his policy platform, there is a pillar called the President Trump's plan to dismantle the deep state and return power to the American people, right? So they don't mince words here. It calls for relentless politicization of the federal government, with presidential appointees overpowering career officials at every turn. Item number 1 in this policy document was the reissuing of a 2020 executive order that would have created a new job category for federal civil service employees in policy-related positions. It was referred to as Schedule F, and it would basically exempt a large number, and we're talking thousands, potentially tens of thousands, depending on which department we're talking about, of civil service employees from protections as being apolitical bureaucrats, right? So the effective, the punchline here is that if you can recategorize civil servants as political appointees, then you can replace them and essentially, disrupt the administrative process from the inside out, right? Hollowing out the administrative state. The ideology also includes threats to abolish entire agencies and offices on overtly ideological grounds. During the first Trump administration, there were many political positions, high-level political positions in agencies with that had traditionally opposed Trump's positions in the State Department, in the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, where high-level positions just remained vacant, right? So and really kind of hamstrung those agencies from doing the work related to things like migrant protection, refugee resettlements, environmental protection, etc. There's also, of course, concerns about weaponization of agencies like the Justice Department, the IRS, and other tools of administrative control. Jamil Bouie, who is a political commentator whose work I greatly respect, has called this the politics of domination, right? So this is the idea that we use the administrative state, hollow it out where it's opposed to our platform, and we use it against our enemies where we can. I think while the threat is real, it is probably also overblown. Based on the first Trump term, the administrative deconstruction agenda depended largely on executive orders and policy-making process that flouted the established rules, right? And as a consequence of that, many of Trump's apparent victories were vulnerable to political reversal or legal nullification. So even some of the most high-profile ones that we can think of, like the Muslim ban, right, was in the courts for many months, did actually get partially upheld in the courts, but some other examples, right, in my work on the refugee resettlement program, it was largely about changing the executive, it's what's called the presidential determination, right, the limit of refugees that would be resettled to the United States through a successive iteration of yearly policies. And it had real consequences for the agencies that worked in that sector and for the policy itself, but it also has rebounded, right, in the period of time since Trump has left office. So I would argue that the greatest threat to democratic institutions, to put it in a sort of simple way, the Trump administration, at least in the first iteration, had proved to be a bit sloppy in its methods and to take shortcuts and to go for quick wins over substantive changes in the policy process, right? And as a function, I think the lasting effects are much less, right? So I think actually the greatest threat in this whole campaign against the deep state is really not necessarily to the integrity, or excuse me, to the longevity of democratic institutions, but to the integrity of those institutions and the propensity of Americans to trust them, which is a really serious issue, of course, but doesn't necessarily mean the death of democracy. I don't know how we're doing on time. I think I want to keep it short so that we have plenty of time for Q&A with the other panelists. In terms of policy, I think we see largely more of the same. There's a lot of bluff and bluster. This is the way, right, that Trump goes about governing. There is image is number one, and substance is a distant second. And so, just to give you some concrete examples, right? In trade policy, both candidates are going to continue a protectionist streak. It's been very clear. Actually, Biden just yesterday announced a 100% increase on tariffs on electric vehicles from China, right? This is a hugely protectionist policy, not in any way different from what we are probably likely to see under Trump. But what Trump does is he often does it in a very unnuanced, just kind of pedal to the metal way, right? So in the policy platform for his second term, he's actually proposing a 10% tariff on all imports across the board, right? Is this likely to happen? Absolutely not. He's certainly going to propose it, and then and just to put things in perspective, right? The U.S. currently applies about a 3% tariff on global trade, excluding tariffs on Chinese goods. So in reality, what we're probably likely to see is a blanket tariff proposed, which will then get watered down with exceptions for major trading partners in places like Japan, South Korea, and the EU. So what we get is a very bold, kind of earth-shaking proposal that in reality becomes something much less than its former self when we get down to nuts and bolts. Climate policy, I think we could say something similar. Biden is obviously going to double down on the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the largest piece of federal legislation ever to address climate change. It made investments in renewable energy, grid energy storage, carbon capture, decarbonization of transportation fleets, all kinds of issues. Trump has said he wants to hollow out the IRA and repeal its clean industry tax credits, but this is a proposal that has been it will have been in place for 2 years by the time he takes office, if he wins the election, and uptake has already been massive. And so it's much less likely that the core elements of the IRA will be repealed, although he will probably do what he's done in the previous administration, which is to try to free up protected federal land for drilling via executive action, to propose new tax incentives for domestic oil and gas production and the like, right? So to undermine in certain areas around the edges, but not necessarily to overturn the legislative foundation that currently exists. You're all looking very skeptical, like I'm not convincing you at all. The last piece I want to, last two maybe, immigration and foreign policy. Certainly, Biden has much softer rhetoric on immigration, and he has sought to open up channels for legal immigration, especially in the area of temporary protection. There's a flagship program for Ukrainians called Uniting for Ukraine. There's a process for Cubans, Nicaraguans, Haitians, and Venezuelans. There are several other kinds of, I like to think of them as sort of policy half measures. They're not actually solutions to forced displacement or immigration, but they are a step in the right direction. But in reality, Biden's immigration policies have maintained tough controls on illegal immigration. He's introduced even more strict asylum procedures and enforced, including forced deportations, right, to places where we know people are facing grave danger. And so the record on immigration is actually very, very mixed. And of course, Trump will take a scorched earth approach, very, bluff and bluster. But in reality, how much of the difference will actually materialize in terms of enacted policy, I think is questionable. We'll probably get more of that wall for what it's worth, which is not very much. Okay, lastly, in foreign policy, this might be one of the main points of difference. I think it's a difficult terrain, of course, always changing. I think from the perspective maybe of Europe, one of the biggest concerns is about support for Ukraine and for the NATO alliance, right? And I think the comments that he made several months ago about, wanting other NATO members to pay up and to increase military spending was shocking and really disturbing to a lot of people. It follows the pattern, right? It follows the pattern of, I'm going to say something really provocative, something that gets people upset, something that makes them pay attention, that makes me look tough. And when we get down to it, hopefully I'll move the needle a little bit. And I think the intention of actually withdrawing completely from NATO is very, very unlikely when we consider all of the policy options in practice. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Q&A.
Thank you, Ronald. And what did you question? Question? Okay. Everyone happening. So the first was about streets. Everything just to their and fight all the
both of the computers have Zoom open, so yeah, you could probably just move it over to them.
I don't think I will.
Far from the
Oh yeah. So I keep on forgetting. What the deep states or
Swing states.
swing states. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. States, yes.
Okay. Swing states and just
Gasoline.
in general or more under price of gasoline.
Shall we go in the order in which presenters went, or
That's
whoever?
I got to.
What's the question, please?
There was a question about the swing.
if there are any specific factors.
The swing states this election will be like the swing states in the last 2 or 3. They'll be very close. They'll be decided by a handful of voters going one way or another. That the whole election is, as far as I'm concerned, basically over, except for a very small percentage of voters. And it doesn't look especially good for Biden. Not terrible, but not good.
Paul?
I can't really add much more to that. It's the 6 states that determined it last election are going to be the ones that matter. So it's Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. And New York Times just this week came out with statewide polls for those 6. Biden was down in each of those, but right now polling is a lot of noise. So similar to kind of an echo of what Ron was saying during his presentation, it's really early. So right now there's a lot of static, and the polls aren't really reflecting how people will vote.
The best way of understanding polls this far from the election is like a horse race. Flea Biscuit might be ahead down the backstretch, but it doesn't mean Flea Biscuit's going to win. Maybe Flea Biscuit has a history of tiring in the last quarter of the race. And so the polls right now are not, it's not that they're wrong, it's just that many things are going to change for that small percentage of voters who are actually up in the air. And there's going to be billions of dollars spent on this election, large amounts of it from Biden. And so the polls now are not believable, except that Biden has to get he's got to kick his horse into gear faster. And whether he can do so, I'm not convinced.
Yeah, I'm actually from one of those 5 swing states that Paul mentioned, Wisconsin. And of these 5 swing,
Well, you're yourself on Zoom so that the
Okay, I
others
can
can
be
hear.
We can hear him.
Okay.
Good.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's
So,
fine.
of those 5 swing states, 4 of them are currently going for Trump. Now, I agree with what Ron says. It's way too early in the process to read too much into this. One of them, Wisconsin, where I'm from, and it's the city that I live in, Milwaukee, which is hosting this year's Republican National Convention that will nominate their candidate, and that will be in late July, launching us into November presidential election in Wisconsin. Biden is ahead. Now, one has to remember that in 2016, when we saw Trump win, he won our state by a paltry 15,000 votes. That's in a state with 5.6 million people, roughly the population of Finland. So 15,000 people actually were able to swing this election. One of the things that we see in Wisconsin, speaking to your point, Gabby, is that in Wisconsin, people right now are pretty upset with our Republican state legislature. So it's, along with North Carolina, the most gerrymandered body, legislative body in the country, very Viktor Orban style. And after a dozen years of this, they're really fed up. They're very angry, and this seems to be turning the electorate against the Republicans generally. At the same time, they don't much care for our Democratic governor, who is a figure who doesn't really do much of anything. People don't really hate him, and they really don't love him. He's just this force that's walking around the room quietly. But I would say that Republican factor is the one that is going to be potentially decisive. And then with gasoline prices, I think we need to worry about not so much foreign actors, but domestic ones. I think dirty oil in the United States will be doing everything that it can to jack up prices in order to continue getting the subsidies which they currently enjoy and to do whatever they can to slow down the green transition. So will they be trying to get gasoline prices up? Will there be all of a sudden problems at gasoline refineries, which reduce supply and all the rest? I think you can bet on it.
If I might introduce 2 variables we haven't talked about yet. And one of them is Robert Kennedy Jr. And who he's going to steal votes from and how many votes. And that could affect the election. The other is Chicago 2024. We really have to pay attention. Chicago 1968 was a critical event for the Democratic Party. Chicago 2024 will be a critical event. There will be massive protests in the streets, and some of it will spill to the convention floor. And what the effect will be is still uncertain. But the only game in town right now, since the candidates are selected, the delegates are selected, the platforms are selected, the strategies are pretty much selected, the really only variable out there is the streets in Chicago in 2024 and whether it spills into the convention and whether 2024 looks like 1968.
Great, thank you so much. Other questions?
Oh, do you have a similar reaction about street activism?
Definitely, and it would go back to the primary point I was trying to make with my presentation, which is that there's a wing of the Democratic Party that is very, very cosmopolitan, socially liberal. Those tend to be the educated. They tend to be younger, not exclusively, but they tend to be. And that is at odds with the working class base that the Democratic Party is trying to hang on to. And, to put a finer point on what Ron said about the street activity, it's how does not only the Chicago Police Department and the mayor handle the protesters, but how does the Democratic Party handle them? And how do they, again, thread the needle to satisfy white working class voters who perhaps want to vote Democratic, but are not going to stand for sort of a overtly socially liberal platform from the Democrats. And I don't think, you know, as Ron said earlier, I don't think they're going to vote Republican. They're not going to, but they may not vote. And, you know, the actual partisans, you know, we see it in Europe also, but there is a process of de-alignment that's happening within the United States, where you have 43% of the voting public who identify themselves as independents. Now, they're reliably weak Republicans or Democrats, but those are the ones who are also more likely to exit if they don't like what their party's doing. And it's that exiting strategy for the white working class that's going to be critical, and they're the ones that are going to be watching how the Democratic Party handles those street protests.
Thank you. We have a question in the back.
One moment. There you go.
Okay. Now, can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Stinge microfonul. Volumul.
Yeah, in a minute.
Do you want me to? I'm using this laptop to relay questions.
Okay. It's too much echo.
Oh, is there an issue with echo?
Now? Maybe if I ask the question there,
Oh, it might
or
work. Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah. I think if you go up, it'll work.
Well, perhaps here, yeah, it's better. Hello. My question was, I was wondering for lots of people who are outside the US and are wondering, just like me, why in the past years, let's say in the past year or the past 2 years, why both the electorate, let's say, and both the Republican and the Democrat political class weren't able to put forward much fresher and younger candidates. There was much speculation about Ron DeSantis and Gavin Newsom from the Democrats, or they were at least debated in the media, and many people wonder why couldn't the political class of America find better candidates than Biden and Trump for this 2024 elections? Thank you.
If I may, to start it off, the people who are making the decision are not deciding about Biden versus anyone or Trump versus anyone. If Biden or Trump get out of the way, there'll be a bloodbath within the party. And the donors, that means the donors lose money, because donors will be giving to candidates who will not succeed. And therefore, they're getting no return on their finance. And so from the donor side, an open contest is a bad thing. Better pick safe than contested. And the advantages of the incumbent, Biden minimally could be challenged, I suspect. Trump was running like an incumbent. It has been for 4 years now. And so it's going to be really hard to turn around. Let me ask the question back to Romania. Why is Jana doing so well in the presidential polling? It's the same thing, sort of familiar names and safe.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. Both parties are risk adverse, and as odd as it may sound, someone like Trump is the safest bet out of the candidates that were fielded. The other candidates on the Republican side could not find a coalition around them. They had pockets of support, but they could not find broad support. And Trump understood that he was the default leader and would remain that. He just had to weather it. On the Democratic side, it does come down to money. Newsom as well as Pritzker. So Pritzker is the governor of Illinois. Were both possibilities, and they were possibilities primarily because they have the ability to finance a lot of the campaign themselves. They're personally wealthy. Neither seemed willing to do that, and I would say that like the other donors, they were risk adverse. That was a lot of money they'd be putting on the line, and it was unclear how they would fare. So, but otherwise, out of the Democratic Party, you have some rising stars, but no one that is the heir apparent, and that's going to take some time. But the Democratic Party right now is very discombobulated. It's very disorganized. The Republicans are a little bit more together, but they're together, and Trump understands that they're together around him.
Yeah, I think actually we have seen really serious challenges to the candidates advanced by both parties. We saw it in 2016. And Bernie Sanders nearly took over the Democratic Party in terms of securing that nomination. Both in 2016 and in 2020, the Democrats launched a counterattack, and they were able to euthanize him on both instances. It was dirty. Trump, by contrast, has been part of this kind of slow motion coup d'etat within the Republican Party that has seen it being taken over by the populist right. There is no consensus that this man should be leading the party. He's just wrestled it away from them. And he's done an incredible job. He's done it with less money. He's done it with popular support. Now, of course, he's had some financial factors that have helped him along the way. There have been people blowing into his sales. But this is really something quite different, to my mind, in U.S. politics, these huge changes to the status quo. Now, of course, with Biden, I would agree with both Paul and Ron that, we are back to politics as normal within the Democratic Party. But something has happened within the Republican Party. It's been transformed. And there are many within that party who are very unhappy with the direction that the party has gone into trouble.
Echo. A question and a comment, actually. So, because you're an expert on judicial politics, I was wondering whether you could say something about this kind of idea of constitutional hardship laid against the second term presidency and attacks on liberal democratic institutions and checks and balances. So, do you think the courts would be more activist than they were in the first term to stand up to defend liberal democratic institutions? Then the comment, I think we shouldn't read too much in the first term and try to anticipate how drastic the changes might be, because if you look at the other executive advisors, not just Mr. Europe, but definitely for Kaczynski and Orban, after they were voted out and then came back with the program and much more eventful and so on. And that happened in Latin America. Trump is really going for that. And will there be any kind of hard work?
Yeah, to the same point, I think that's a fair point. I think it's maybe an unsatisfactory answer, but there is something about Trump being a personal figure here that is certainly thing. I don't know, kind of the back of guys. It's very difficult for political officers to on message to keep them. And so,
A bit closer, so they can hear you.
Sure. So I think certainly there are people who are considering how to make cuts more extreme and to make them more permanent. But I think there is caveat there. As far as judicial politics, my read on the situation is that the court, to some degree, sees that it has perhaps overstepped a bit in some landmark decisions that that have gotten a lot of blowback. And I do think that there has been some indication of a moderating force at the level of the Supreme Court. But I can't answer.
Yeah, I'm definitely not a courts guy, so but I want to thank everybody. I apologize, but I really have to leave. So have a great rest of your conference. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. If there are other thoughts from currently the question.
Sorry, maybe a question for me.
Okay.
Of course.
Okay.
We see a third party in the US. I mean, a lot of people identify as independents or somewhere in between. Is there any movement towards a third party coming up?
The rules of US elections makes it extremely difficult to form a third party. It is stacked. It's an oligopoly in which they don't want to let anyone in. They hate each other, Democrats and Republicans, but they hate challenge even more. So they're going to do their damnedest not to let a third party form. As for all these independents, I've got a neighbor who says he's independent. You ask him, who'd you vote for the last election? Republicans. Who'd you vote for the election before that? Republicans. And the election before that? Republicans. And the election before that, you know, if it smells like a horse and acts like a horse and whinnies like a horse, it's a horse. Most of the time, we can sort these so-called independents by their voting patterns. And, you know, the actual number of true independents who vary election to election with some sort of random distribution is a very small percentage of the electorate. Now, weak party identifiers have increased, but strong party identifiers have increased even more. Sorry for being pessimistic. The main conclusion that I hear from all of us is that we do not expect this election to represent a transformation in the tensions, stalemate, divisiveness, polarization, and anger that has beset US politics over the last 8-10 years. And in fact, it may exacerbate it. That's the important thing. Yeah, Mo or Larry or Curly might win the election, but the general state of America will continue to be not favorable. I don't know, you guys, Jeff, Dan, do you have the same reaction?
I agree. I would only add a further pessimistic note in that the United States might deal with this sense of decline by engaging in further foreign adventures. Not that it doesn't have enough going right now, but it can always be worse.
Or domestic adventure.
Okay, so on this truly optimistic note, we thank you, Ron, thank you, Jeff and Daniel, thank you.
Lorraine, you have our hearts.
Yes.
Big hugs to you.
Same. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
Great seeing you,
Take care.
Ron.
Enjoy.
Okay, well, I guess looks like that was it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Maureen.